In a bit of surprising news, Kevin Lee apparently announcing his retirement. This according to a post he made on his Threads account saying, I'm going to retire from the UFC, but I can't find the right words to use in a video. And then he made another post a few days ago saying there's more to life than fighting. Certainly seems like this might be the end of the road for Kevin Lee, who is only 30 years old. Like the title of this video says, this is just honestly sad. There's no other way to put it. And I know there's people watching this video who don't like Kevin Lee, don't like some of the things that he said, but I want to remind people that Kevin Lee was a very big star in the UFC at one point, and to see it kind of go out like this, if this is in fact the end, is frankly just sad. So we're going to go through some of the things with Kevin Lee and that have happened over his career, and we'll just talk about how I think Kevin Lee in the long run kind of got a bit of a raw deal here. Of course, Kevin coming off that loss to Renat back at UFC Vegas 76, who's finished in the first round, just a very bad performance, but a fight that, let's be honest here, I don't think people were thinking he was going to win, and we'll talk about that whole situation with him fighting Renat in his return UFC fight. But I want to go back with Kevin Lee and just talk a little bit about his career. I've known Kevin for a very long time. I was actually put in touch with him by his old manager, Stefan Patry. Kevin Lee actually fought in Canada in his first couple pro fights for Instinct MMA, a promotion that Stefan Patry was involved with. And that's how Stefan Patry started managing Kevin Lee. I think people forget that, he had his first two fights in Montreal for this promotion Instinct, which doesn't exist anymore. And and so, Patry sort of reached out and knew that I was sort of doing interviews, and we sort of, we went way back. And so Kevin and I did a bunch of interviews, and I actually got to meet him in person for the first time at his fight against Jake Matthews, which was back in July of 2016. That was a big win for Kevin at the time because Jake Matthews was someone that the UFC was pushing, kind of like a prospect versus prospect matchup. And I didn't even realize this until I was sort of doing this video. Kevin Lee was the underdog in this fight. He was plus 130. Jake Matthews was the favorite, and Kevin Lee went out there and finished him in the first round. And this was really the fight that I think propelled Kevin Lee to the next level, because Kevin Lee was a great self-promoter. Okay, that was one of the things in his interviews that he really captivated the attention. The whole persona, the Motown phenom, being from Michigan and all that stuff. 13-2 at the time. Very, very interesting, career at this point. And this was sort of the start of him getting some big wins, finishing Mustafayev, finishing Francisco Trinaldo, and the Michael Chiesa win. Very big win for him there. There was a bit of back and forth. Remember the whole press conference with Chiesa saying, don't talk about my mom, all this stuff. Lee was one of the biggest biggest stars in the lightweight division at the time. And that got him a interim title shot against Tony Ferguson back in October of 2017, which wasn't that long ago, if you think about it. And look, that fight, he lost. Kevin Lee, tough weight cut in that one, ended up sort of gassing out later in the fight, but he had some success early on against Ferguson. And it's one of those what ifs. If Lee would have maybe pushed a little bit more, maybe finishes Ferguson, I don't know. But this was sort of the peak of Kevin Lee's career. And like I said, one of the biggest stars in the UFC, definitely the biggest star, one of the biggest stars in the lightweight division as well, at a time when you had Habib and, a lot of these other names in the weight class. So Kevin Lee, again, a lot of stardom there. And at the time, just 25 years old, right? I think what people forget is that Lee fights for an interim title at 25. Ferguson was 33. There was a lot of promise, a lot of potential there for Kevin Lee. But things unfortunately took a turn for the worse after that. So he loses that fight. He fights Edson Barbosa, kind of a wacky fight. If you remember, Barbosa ends up cracking Lee at that point. Lee's on wobbly legs. There's that gif somewhere of him sort of walking around. And then the Al Iaquinta fight, I think, really kind of changed the trajectory of Kevin Lee's career. It was a fight that, let's be honest, Al defeated him quite soundly. And, some fighters have other fighters' numbers. And I think that was the case with Al Iaquinta, because Kevin Lee's only other loss, one of his other losses, he actually lost to Leo Santos as well, was Al Iaquinta. That was his loss in his UFC debut. And, some people felt like, it was the debut. He had some jitters maybe. But this fight really showed that, Kevin needed to work on a few things. So rather than stay at 155, which I think was a better weight class for him, he moves up to 170 pounds and he fights Rafa Dos Anjos in a fight that ended up going 4 rounds, and Dos Anjos ends up finishing him late in that fight. But I think, Lee, again, big guy for 155 in terms of his frame, not very tall, not very long for the weight class. So he tried his hand at welterweight, didn't go well. And then he moves down to fight Gregor Gillespie on the BMF title card. I was again at that fight. And, he moves down a weight class. He's working with Firas Zahabi. You think he's making a change for the better, and it works out well for him. He gets a first round finish over Gregor, who was undefeated at the time. And again, Kevin Lee, an underdog in the situation. You think Kevin Lee's going to turn things around a little bit, fighting at lightweight, which I still maintain this was the best weight class he competed in. If he could get his weight under control, he was very good. And this is still one of the best knockouts you'll see in the UFC, with Kevin Lee knocking out Gregor Gillespie, handing him his first loss. But then what happens after that? He fights Charles Oliveira. And look, a lot of us at the time, including myself, did not know how good Charles Oliveira was, how he was going to turn his career around. And if you remember that fight, it was Oliveira actually outstriking Kevin Lee at a certain point in the fight and then getting the guillotine choke and finishing him. And this was the card that was right before COVID. So it was kind of this really kind of weird circumstances as well. So Oliveira wins, and we know what happened after that. Oliveira would go on to win all of his fights until he fought Islam. And Kevin Lee obviously falling short, disappointing fight. Because again, if Lee wins that, maybe you're having that conversation about him fighting Khabib at some point, because Khabib, again, Khabib hadn't really fought like a ton of wrestlers, and Lee had good wrestling at the time. And I know talking about this now sounds crazy, but at the time there were people intrigued by a potential Kevin Lee and Khabib matchup because of the wrestling, and Lee's got good stand-up as well too. So this was a key loss for him as well. And then that basically confirmed that Lee shouldn't stay at 155 and he would come back at 170. And what happened? We have COVID. We had Kevin Lee having some serious injuries. He had the knee injury, so he's out for a while, right? He injures his knee in the fight with, I believe it was either in training or was after that. I can't remember exactly, but he has the fight with Oliveira, and then he has the 2 scheduled fights with Sean Brady. You have COVID, the gyms are closed down. He's doing rehab and all this. So he's supposed to fight Sean Brady the first time. Lee gets a rib injury in that one. Then he's supposed to fight Sean Brady again, and then Brady gets an injury. And who steps in? Daniel Rodriguez, and Rodriguez wins the fight. I think that was a fight that a lot of people felt like Lee was going to win. I felt the same way. Lee was actually the favorite in that one, and Rodriguez ends up winning. And it was basically at that point, I think the UFC kind of decided, okay, Lee's not what we thought he was, right? Because there was some superstar potential there. There was the fact that Kevin Lee was getting paid a lot. And you look at the timing of this fight, right? When did this fight take place? This fight took place in August of 2021. What's going around in the summer? Dana White's Contender Series. So it was one of those situations, and we see this every year, where the UFC signs a bunch of fighters from Dana White's Contender Series. They try and trim the fat, so to speak. And Kevin Lee was a casualty of that, as the UFC released Kevin Lee, cut him from his contract after that loss to Daniel Rodriguez. And you remember at the time, a lot of people were like, yeah, we lost to Rodriguez, he stinks. But I mean, realistically, it was 2 losses. Kevin Lee was not that old in the promotion. It was just the fact that he was making too much money. So the UFC let him go, and there was, everyone was interested to see where Kevin Lee would go next. And he ends up signing with Eagle FC. And this was a good situation for him because he's headlining the card. He's getting paid in Bitcoin, which was a bit different. And he's fighting at 165, which I think is a perfect division for someone like Kevin Lee, who's not very big in terms of height and reach, but is very stocky and could do quite well in that weight class. And I'll be honest, Kevin Lee did not put on a very good performance in that fight against Diego Sanchez. He got the win, but it was kind of a gimme fight if you think about it. And it was kind of the perfect storm for Kevin to get back on the winning track. Sanchez had taken a ton of damage in his career. Sanchez is a notable name winning the Ultimate Fighter, someone that people were familiar with. And Kevin went out there and got the win, but not the type of win you were hoping of him sort of getting like a first round finish or something like that. So Lee gets the victory. All is good. But then stuff happens with Eagle FC. And, to this day, I still don't know exactly what the deal was. Eagle FC, that was basically one of their, they didn't do that many events. Remember at the time, by the way, people talking about Eagle FC being like a rival to the UFC and all this stuff because Habib was running with it, running the promotion and all that. It was, they only did a couple of US events, and then basically Eagle FC, the US version, basically went away. So Kevin Lee was kind of in the spot where he's not fighting. He doesn't know what's next. And he's seeing all these guys leaving Eagle FC because there's no shows going on in the US. So Kevin Lee's kind of in this spot. And I remember interviewing him at the time being like, what's going on? Obviously he had some more injuries post the Diego Sanchez fight, but it was one of those things where, what's Kevin's next move if he's not going to fight in Eagle FC? So there were some rumblings and some rumors from what I heard that Kevin Lee was in talks with PFL, but honestly, I think that would have been a bad situation for Kevin Lee because for 2 reasons. Number one, he fights at 170, he's going to be undersized, right? And say what you want about PFL, but they have some good fighters. Like this Kevin Lee beat a Ray Cooper, for example. I don't know if he does. That's a tough weight class. An Olivier, someone like that. It's tough to say. Sorry, not Olivier. Olivier's 155. But you get what I mean. At the 170 weight class, I think would have been too tough. And then Kevin can't fight at 155 in PFL because can he make the weight that frequently? I doubt it. So PFL I don't think was a good option. I do wonder in hindsight if he should have just taken less money and gone with someone like Bellator. I do wonder if Bellator would have done the proper matchmaking, built him back up again to get to Lee where he was before. Because again, Lee, great promoter, entertaining fighter. I think there was a lot of potential there. On top of all this going on here, Lee's manager, Markel Martin of CAA, same manager for Ngannou and so many other fighters that were rep by them, Rory McDonald, basically leaves the industry. So Lee's kind of without a manager. I know he said he left his manager and all that, but really Markel, and I like him, always had good things to say about Markel, nothing bad there. He kind of stepped away a bit from MMA, so Lee wasn't really getting the attention he deserved. Now, I can tell you guys this. I had interviewed Lee, and after the interview, Lee and I had talked, and I said, what are you going to do about management? And Lee told me off air that he was going to sign with another management company. I'm not going to mention which one it was, but I had heard that he was going to sign with this other management company. It's like, okay, all good. Well, he doesn't end up signing with that management company. He ends up signing with Dominance MMA, and you know who's in charge of Dominance. And there's obviously a relationship there because Kevin used to train in Vegas. The head manager of Dominance MMA obviously lives there. So there was a past relationship, not to mention the fact that this manager as well was someone that helped facilitate the deal with him getting the deal at Eagle FC, right? With the ties to Khabib Nurmagomedov. So he ends up signing with him. And I thought at the time that when he signed with him that he was going to go to PFL because obviously he has strong ties with them. To the surprise of everyone, Kevin Lee ends up signing with the UFC, which was a bit surprising because he only had one fight, and we heard that, okay, Lee needed to build himself up back a little bit, but you know, you hear that he's re-signed with the UFC. A bit surprising, right? Because he just had one win against Diego Sanchez. It's not like he had a ton of fights out there to sort of build himself back up. And you got to think too, if Lee's coming back to the UFC, he's probably getting paid a bit well, right? But we know now why Kevin Lee was brought back into the UFC, and it's because they were matching him up with a prospect. So this is my take on this, and you guys might disagree or agree with me on this one. I think the only reason Kevin Lee was brought back into the UFC is because the UFC wanted to use him as a name to build up other prospects, and that's exactly what they did with Renat in that fight. Renat's an absolute killer. Let's look at the fights that Renat had before this. 21-2, finishing a lot of his opponents. You know, he had just beat Brian Battle the fight previously, and Brian Battle was a guy that, you know, did quite well in the Ultimate Fighter. You know, he ends up beating him pretty soundly. It was a dominant fight. And so now he's fighting Kevin Lee, I think, to sort of boost up Renat even more. And listen, I know people are going to call me biased by saying this, but that's what good management is for. Kevin shouldn't have had to fight Renat. That was a bad matchup. The second that fight got announced, I said this to people in my Discord, Kevin's not winning that fight. And this looks like a setup fight to build up Renat. Now, maybe the UFC, maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe the UFC thought, okay, if Kevin's really got, you know, a lot left in the tank here, let's see him go and beat this prospect. But I really feel like the UFC's idea here was to build up Renat, and that's exactly what happened. Renat going out there and finishing Kevin Lee in the very first round. Here's something else I don't know if all of you know. Renat was training in Vegas a little bit. He actually trained a little bit at the PI. Look who he's training with a couple weeks before his fight with Kevin Lee. Check this out. Okay, 2 weeks ago. This was before the fight with Kevin Lee. Does that guy look familiar? Isn't that Kevin Lee's manager? Why on earth is Renat right here, this is Renat's account, training with his manager? That's a really bad look as far as I'm concerned. And again, I know that manager is the reason that Kevin Lee got in the UFC. He has the ties to it, but that's a terrible look. And again, this goes back to the title of the video. This entire situation is sad. I think Lee signed with the wrong management. I think Lee shouldn't have signed with the UFC, to be honest. I think he should have gone elsewhere, built up his resume a little bit, get back on track. And I think the biggest mistake that Kevin Lee made was coming back at 170. He has had far more success at 155. I know it's a process for him, but dude, spend the money and get a nutritionist and work with someone to get down to 155. I do believe it's possible. I'm not a health practitioner or anything, anything like that, but I'm sure there was a way that he could have made the weight to some degree if he really just put effort in it. He might not be fighting as much, but I think Kevin Lee would have been far better at 155 than 170 because he didn't end up getting any big wins at 170, right? Let's go look back at his resume here. Diego Sanchez is the only one he's had at 170. Gillespie, 155. Barbosa, 155. Chiesa, Trinaldo. And we've seen it over the years that Kevin Lee has had trouble making weight here. You even go back to his early career. He missed weight against Kyle Prepelic in that... in his fourth fight, came in at 158, came in at 157, had a catch weight at 160. He's always had trouble making weight. And I know as you get older, it's tougher to cut weight, but I just wonder if he would have, maybe, I don't know, at least given it a shot with a really legit nutritionist. Cause I'm telling you, I've interviewed Kevin before almost every one of his fights. I've never once heard about him working with someone specific for his weight cuts, whether that's like Mike Dolce or Perfecting Athletes or Ian Larios or anyone like that, Tyler Minton, anyone like that. I never heard about that with Kevin. And I think that was one of the big reasons why his career did not succeed very well too. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Kevin. Again, I'll say it one more time. Kevin Lee not officially retired at the time we're doing this, but it certainly looks like this might be the case. And you can understand if he did retire, why he'd want to do that. Kevin's now a father. He's got a family. Maybe it's time to start looking elsewhere for some other options for Kevin Lee. But if this is the end, it's just a sad story as far as I'm concerned, because I think Kevin Lee had so much potential. And I think if there were a few decisions he made in his career, things might have ended up a little bit differently. So I want to know what you guys think in the comment section below. Do you think Kevin Lee is going to stay retired? What do you think Kevin Lee could have done differently in his career? And do you agree with me that the latter half of his career was very much mismanaged? Follow me on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, @LynchOnSports. I'm James Lynch. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.